Hello, and welcome to the last week of our class where we will be covering two modules. We have Module 12 and Module 13. So this podcast is for Module 12, where we will cover Chapter 13, Chronic Illness. Now, Chapter 13 and Chapter 14 are very similar. They play off of one another, where Chapter 13 kind of looks overall at chronic illnesses. What are they? Why do they fall into a special category? How do we approach chronic illness and treat chronic illness? And then when we get to Chapter 14, we'll take more of an in-depth look at several chronic illnesses that are plaguing us today, some of the more serious illnesses. But that's not to say that in this chapter we're not going to look at some specific ones. So let's take a look at what we have here. So if we go over the objectives, you're going to see that it really is giving you a broad overview of how individuals and families adjust to chronic illness. You're going to take a look at initial reactions that a person has to a chronic condition. There's sort of the initial setting in phase when a person gets the diagnosis, whether it's diabetes or whether it's heart disease or whether it's, like I have up here, stroke, COPD, a lung disorder, whatever it might be. There's an initial reaction to sort of, what do I do? How am I going to take care of myself? Is there a cure? Am I going to live? And once a person gets past some of that, then it's, oh, wow, okay, I'm going to have this for a while. Now, how do I adjust my life around it or to it? So then that takes us into the various influences on coping. So how does an individual cope with that quote unquote kind of health crisis that they go through? And what does that coping process involve? We've talked a lot about coping in this class, but usually within the context of coping with stress, but also, coping with a person that has a drug addiction or an eating disorder. We've looked at various different aspects of coping as we've covered all the major topics in this class. So now we're going to be looking at chronic illness and coping with that. And we will get into some specifics. So we'll look at the impact of a few different chronic conditions. We've got asthma, epilepsy, nervous system injuries, diabetes, and arthritis. Those are the ones covered in this chapter. And then in the next chapter, we'll take a more in-depth look at a few of the big heavy hitters. But for each of these different chronic diseases that we're covering here, I'd like you to be able to explain what they are, what the physiology is of each disorder, the causes and effects of that, and then what the medical regimen for the person would look like. So what would they need to be doing to manage their disease? And then also, what would the psychosocial factors be? And here's where we can get a little more in detail with comparing and contrasting the various psychosocial interventions for people with chronic conditions. So there's a lot of support out there for folks who have chronic illness. And there's different types of approaches that one might take to treating one of those chronic conditions. And so you're going to see a variety of interventions, and a lot of them aimed at the psychology of what the person's going through, and then socially how their life is changing, right? So there's individual factors of what the person's going through, and then social factors, what them and their family are going through. There could be work-related changes that the person's facing. They may be out of work. There may be financial considerations due to medical treatment, due to being out of work. There can be strain on family members as relationship dynamics can change along with chronic conditions. So all of that falls into there. So that's really gets into the factors influencing a person's adjustment to chronic illness, which can take months to years for for people to adjust. So we'll look at the various different types of approaches. There's educational approaches, those that focus on social support, and then different behavioral methods of intervention, as well as techniques like relaxation and biofeedback, which really work to just aid in the coping process with chronic illness. They're not going to be standalone types of therapy. And also cognitive methods would sort of be ones that would aid in the treatment of chronic illness, not to treat. And really, a lot of these are used interchangeably. Okay, so we look at collaborative and integrative care approaches, which might touch on many of these different intervention techniques to kind of find what works best for the person. Also, interpersonal and family therapy works really well as counseling approaches to helping a person and helping the family adjust to chronic illness. So that gives you a nice overview of chronic illness. There is a video assignment. Has to do with cancer support groups and the work of Jon Kabat-Zinn. He is a medical doctor who runs cancer support groups, and then David Spiegel. And so I think the video focuses a little bit more on David Spiegel and his work. There might be some mention of Jon Kabat-Zinn. You're familiar actually with Kabat-Zinn from when we covered alternative treatment and complementary medicine. But David Spiegel's work in cancer, it was really groundbreaking in the 90s when there wasn't a really good approach to cancer treatment. We were doing all the biological things necessary to treat the person's cancer, try to get rid of it, and help the person sort of target it biologically, but there wasn't a lot going on in the way of psychosocial support. And what David Spiegel found is that when women in particular with metastatic breast cancer, those were his subjects in his study, when they were able to talk about what was going on and kind of work through their diagnoses and their treatment weekly and meet and talk together, they did better overall. So I'm not going to get into a lot of the details because I really want you to watch the video, but it's just amazing the level that social support and talk therapy, what we call like interpersonal and family therapy, can do for a person with a real diagnosis like cancer. And metastatic breast cancer is a terminal cancer. The mortality rate is certain. Women can expect to live anywhere from 1 to 5-ish years with that type of cancer. It's metastatic, so it's spreading, right? So it starts out as breast cancer and it spreads to other tissues and organs. And when it gets to that point, there's not a lot that can be done. It's really about extending the quality of life for the person with however much time they have left. And so David Spiegel found that when women participated in support groups, they did much better. They lived a little longer than women who didn't. And that's a lot. That's pretty groundbreaking to add any amount of time onto a person's life who has a terminal illness is pretty amazing. So that's what the video assignment is about. So you can click in here, watch the video, and then answer the questions and submit those by clicking in the link. I'm sorry, the video is right here. If you click here, and then you will print these out or write them out and then submit them to the assignment link. And just remember when you watch the video that watching it on Chrome or Firefox is probably best. Safari's not going to let you click into the video, most likely. And then lastly, your discussion for this module will focus on Chapter 13 of the Longevity book, looking at masculine and feminine traits in individuals and how they serve us well in terms of our health and our longevity. And so it's a really interesting chapter. We typically in our society today don't really realize all the time what kinds of traits we deem masculine and what kinds of traits we deem feminine, and just how those can be very different in terms of how we take care of ourselves. So you'll be defining masculinity and femininity. How did the term and project define those traits? Like what kinds of traits were seen as masculine and what kind were seen as feminine? And why is actually that important to distinguish from the labels of homosexual or heterosexual? Because we're talking about very different concepts here. We're talking about traits being masculine or feminine, right? Which is very different from sexual orientation. One can be masculine or feminine, and it doesn't really matter what their sexual orientation is. So that's what we're talking about here. And then describe the relationship between feminine traits, those quote unquote traits that are more feminine, and long life. What's the link there? As well as links between social ties and gender, which genders tend to keep social ties better. You might already know this from previous chapters. I've given you some hints and some previews. And then what happens to men's health typically, and what did happen to men's health with the termites after they've suffered a loss, what tends to be the case there. Being educated on the health benefits of feminine characteristics for men and women can be good. So how might you respond if someone made a very stereotypical statement such as, my son won't have sissy traits? Right? We hear these kinds of platitudes all the time, statements, and how do you feel about that? And after reading this chapter and understanding the benefit of feminine traits, how might that serve a more masculine type person well? So what do we have to gain or learn from those more feminine traditional characteristics? So that wraps up that chapter for the longevity project. And also for Module 12, our next podcast will be the last one, covering Module 13.